Hi everyone, I'm Danielle Byington, and in this video we are talking about Tadeusz Borowski's This Way for the Gas Ladies and Gentlemen. This is very much a dark memoir. This was written about a year after Borowski survived 2 years of being imprisoned in concentration camps. So he was Polish. He came from a community that was because the borders have changed over the decades. At the time, this part of Poland is in what is today a part of Western Ukraine. And because he was Polish, once there was Nazi occupation in Poland, um, education, like higher education especially, um, it was banned, it was forbidden, but there were like underground education kind of sources, and so he was able to do that, and it was in various homes. He was able to do that, and he is eventually caught, though, and he is sent to a concentration camp. So you see here, I've listed Auschwitz and Dachau. And if you're wondering, like, why would they go through the expense of moving people around, if they did have loyal workers or at least prisoners who hadn't presented too much of a problem, then you want to kind of move them around ever so often so they don't become comfortable with the guards, perhaps. Also, becoming familiar with the schedules and routines and the layouts of these places so they're less likely to be able to organize a rebellion or escape in general. So what we are reading, something about this last bullet point. So I said he wrote this. This is an autobiography about his experience living in the concentration camps. So it's a collection of short stories. And so what we are reading is an excerpt. If you're a student in my class, what I'm talking about is an excerpt that's in the Norton Anthology, Volume 2 collection of Western literature. So he is recounting some of the routines that he experienced daily. In this case, we're talking about the transports coming in, the trains coming into the camps and depositing people who, in this case, it says they are told that all the transports coming in this day, all of them go to the gas chamber. No one is set aside to remain just a prisoner and be a laborer in the camp. For this sort of daily routine, he described it as choosing physical or spiritual survival. So it's a little bit of both. If you can imagine being in this situation, like the disgust that he has with himself for what he's having to do every day, um, you're choosing to stay alive because maybe you could perceive it as, well, it's easier to fight the system from inside if you are alive rather than if you are dead in a mass grave somewhere. Sure, but that comes with its own price. In this case, with Borowski, he ends up taking his own life shortly after this is published. I think a couple years or so after it's published. As you can imagine, I mean, even reading it, you see all the trauma he's experienced, the PTSD he must have lived with, um, the survivor's guilt of recounting, sending people onto their death, and just having to stand there for the physical survival and have no control over being able to do anything about it. Um, and that comes up at that anger that must have been brewing inside of him about this and this physical survival. Some of his spiritual survival comes up sometimes. About halfway through or so, maybe two-thirds of the way through the excerpt in the Norton Anthology, he describes himself as being angry with the Jewish people being brought in on the transports because he says, I know it's because of their existence that I'm imprisoned and have to do this awful thing of sending people on to their death. Like he's an accomplice in murder, basically. And you see how that imprisonment, what he's being forced to do, it's twisted his perception of who's actually needs to be held accountable, who's making him do this. It's the Nazis in being described over and over with their revolvers and their whips standing around the platform and the ramp that he talks about as people emerge from the trains. So with the unloading of the trains, there are a few things I want to talk about through there. So first, the setting before we get to the ramp, we're in just the barracks, and there's been a delousing event. He says they're all naked because their uniforms, the striped uniforms you may have heard of, or maybe even had to read before in maybe middle school or high school, the boy in the striped pajamas. So he talks about the uniforms with the stripes. Those had to be deloused every now and then because you have just totally unsanitary conditions with the prisoners. And so he says it doesn't really matter that we're all naked in the barracks because it's so unbearably hot that everyone's miserable anyways. And then, so they have the uniforms back, the prisoner uniforms back. But also, there's this ordeal of him talking with his French friend, who is a prisoner in the camp as well, Henri. And there are some interesting things that come up about Henri. So one time, at one point, Henri is talking about, he's quoting Karl Marx, who wrote the Communist Manifesto, and he says the thing about, well, religion is the opium of the people. That if they're talking about the rabbi who's a bunk below them or so in the barracks, and how he's praying very, very loudly, and it's getting on their nerves. And they're talking about how, well, if you could take the religion away, everyone wouldn't just complicitly go into the gas chambers and die, believing that there's something better in their afterlife. They would have a rebellion because clearly you see on the platforms that the people being brought in, that the Jewish people being brought in and sent to the gas chambers, they outnumber the guards. Just based on the little bit of description of the numbers you have. That's something else about the numbers. A lot of the description, it even uh, refers to the place as an inferno numerous times, and not just talking about the crematorium, but just the masses, the floods of people. One description, when the first transport comes in, says that all of the Jewish people unloading from the train was like a river that had been let go and it's trying to find its own path because there's so many people. So you have some comparisons of imagery. If you're a student in my class in European literature, we read Dante's Inferno a few weeks ago. So you have some imagery that's comparative to what he's describing going on in the concentration camp here. Um, there's also something else he says to Henri. It's right before the part where the part I already mentioned about how he described himself growing angry with the Jews because he feels like it's their fault that he's imprisoned, because his perception of reality has been skewed by this, right? And he asked Henri after they've unloaded that transport and sent a bunch of people to the gas chambers. He asked Henri, "Are we good people?" And like he's questioning the morality of what they're having to do for the physical survival. It's like the physical survival and his spiritual survival are kind of neck and neck. Like him questioning, "Am I a good person?" Is his spiritual survival, trying to outweigh that physical survival. Um, with something else, when they are going to the ramp right before the transport gets there, a few paragraphs mention a description of the SS officers. And this is really interesting because in this translation by Barbara Vedder, um, she uses the word glittering a lot, talking about they are bemedaled and bejeweled, and they are glittering for all the medals on their uniforms and the shiny silver buttons on their uniforms. And their uniforms, there was a sort of uh, chic about their uniforms that did make them more intimidating because it wasn't your average military uniform. if if you don't know, it's a major high-end designer that's still around today, Hugo Boss, um, who designed the Nazis' uniforms. I think at some point after that, they issued an apology sort of thing to the public, and like we didn't know, like so many other companies. You see, the Red Cross van that's mentioned here, other companies involved with what's happening here with the genocide of people. Um, so the SS officers and the glittering and their shiny black boots, things like that. That language, if you've seen in some of my other videos pertaining to European literature, specifically further back in the ancient literature, when we covered Homer's The Iliad or Euripides' The Trojan Women, um, it came up somewhat in the Aeneid as well. I talked about that word being used, shiny, glittering, flashing, all those synonyms. It's going to be a little different in every translation because the translator takes their own artistic liberties. But remember what I said about that coming up so many times, describing someone like Achilles or Hector's flashing helmet or his shiny shield. It's kind of like this thing it's like looking into the sun. It's shiny and it's pretty, but it can hurt you if you look at it. And so that's kind of metaphoric here with the SS officers who are being described. Um, we have the unloading of the ramp, and it's quite brutal and violent, trying to make people comply and go towards the trucks and be loaded up on the trucks to be taken to the gas chambers. Something he says, Borowski calls it a charity, that they lie to the people and they don't tell them they're about to go to the gas chambers. They say you're just going to be given a shower and then you go into the barracks. I'll see you later. Henri says that about seeing people he knows from France. So there, Borowski calls that a gift, a sort of charity for them that's not knowing that in a few moments they're going to be dead. Um, so after that transport, after everyone is taken out, because you have to understand that on these trains, they only had like little thin slits of windows up high. So if you have the cart overloaded with people just smushed together like sardines, there's not going to be enough oxygen. Some people who are in bad health will smother. They will die of asphyxiation and from the heat as well. And some people it says, were trampled as they had been pressed into the carts. There were infants that their tiny bodies couldn't handle that. And, there's been they haven't had water for the couple of days they've been in transport. So anyone who isn't in the strongest health may not even survive the trip. And so Borowski talks about having to go onto the carts and pull out these bodies of old men and women and of babies that didn't make it, and they're just laying there in the train carts. And the officer makes them hand the dead infants to the people going onto the trucks because it's their kind of their way of cleaning it up so they don't have to deal with it coming off of the cart, um, the corpses on the cart. And there's also this interesting scene in one of the next transports, the um, the girl who with the blonde hair and the golden watch. He says he's just looking at her, seeing this like stoicism in her face, that because she says to him, I know what's going to happen to us. And he just doesn't say anything. And she marches on onto the trucks and to that line, even though she has expressed knowing. And he says he's just looking at her, saying how beautiful she is. And she's this just manifestation of health and life. And then in a few moments, she's being sent into the crematorium, and she's not going to be those things anymore. So he's constantly living in this liminal space of the beauty of life, but also the grotesqueness of his physical survival, the things he has to endure dealing with the transports, and being imprisoned himself. So, one last thing I want to talk about here is, well, two things actually. He talks about the sky. He mentions the sky a couple of times in this one, but it also comes up a lot in the rest of his writing and this story of, excuse me, collection of short stories that are autobiographical. He refers to the sky as the factory ceiling in some of his other writing. And that's a very interesting concept to say that in 1942, before he's even, that's right before he would be imprisoned in the camps, and then his camp is liberated in the spring of 1945. To say that it's the factory ceiling, it's kind of like you never get to leave and go home, that you're always trapped in that authoritarianism that he was experiencing at that time with the Nazi occupation of Poland. Um, so, a lot of things we read in literature are very dark and sad. I see someone mention it in the evaluations of instructors pretty often. And yes, it is because humanity has not always been a like sweet little bowl of peaches, as you can see from reading this. The arts often reflect the mistakes that humans have made with each other. And I think something you would want to think about with this particular reading being written in so post World War II, being written in the mid 20th century, like where it exists on the spectrum of literature. We look all the way back to earlier in my European literature course. We start with the ancient literature, and we have the shadows, the specters, the ghosts coming to us. Um, and now, instead of those journeys to the underworld to ask the dead for advice about what to do, now it's like the dead come to us in a lot of our media. We have it in the sense of literal violence and death, like with Borowski's work, but even at large with the popularity of media that involves things like zombies and vampires, things like that. So now it comes to us as if now we need to look at ourselves and try to do better. That comes up in something Baudelaire says in The Flowers of Evil. He describes random passersby as being harassed by a specter, being harassed by or accosted by a ghost from the past. So it's easy to keep walking on past like what you might think is a ghost. You think of it as being transparent. You can see through it. In most media, we can walk through it. It can't physically touch us, but it's still there. Our past is still there, and even if it is scary, you do have to address it, and you can't ever just walk away from it. Okay, that's all for Borowski's work. Thank you for watching.